Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about endgames. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about rook and pawn endgames. I'm going to be talking about this rook and pawn endgame. I'm going to be talking about general principles and how we apply them to rook and pawn endgames, and what some people's misconceptions are about the general principles, and what we need to learn to kind of advance our play. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and click that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So for starters, let's talk about some general principles that I've seen people throw out and misapply and have misconceptions about in the past. I've heard things like in rook and pawn endgames, rooks always belong behind the passed pawns. I've heard things like outside passed pawns are stronger than central passed pawns, and I've heard just a lot of general principles get thrown out that either aren't correct or get misapplied pretty egregiously. So just to give you an idea of how our understanding of general principles has to change as we advance as a player, I want you to just think about this. When you are a beginning player, we tell beginners, just put your pieces in the center of the board. Your pieces are better if you just put them in the middle of the board. And if you don't plant your pieces on one of the 16 squares located directly in the center of the board, your move doesn't have anything to do with the middle of the board. Now, if you're a more advanced player, I ask you, okay, what about a fianchetto? You know, a fianchetto is when a bishop is placed on g2. Does a fianchetto have something to do with the middle of the board? And of course, as we become stronger players, we realize, yes, absolutely, a fianchetto does have something to do with the middle of the board. If there's a bishop on g2, that bishop is controlling the longest diagonal on the chessboard, and that's actually a very happy bishop. So we have a very happy piece. So one of the general principles that I hear a lot is outside passed pawns are better. And that's kind of what this endgame is about. Here we have white to move in this position, and actually white is clearly better in this position. The pawn structure is completely symmetrical, and white has an extra pawn, and it's this outside passed pawn. But in a rook and pawn endgame, the outside passed pawn is probably one of the weakest passed pawns you can possibly have. And I know that sounds weird. We're all taught as beginners outside passed pawns are much stronger. This is, again, because of what beginner players tend to do. Beginner players will end up simplifying into king and pawn endgames on this ridiculously consistent basis. They will trade down into king and pawn endgames. And of course, every endgame can become a king and pawn endgame, so the most important endgame we have to learn about is king and pawn endgames. And in a king and pawn endgame, the outside passed pawn is very, very strong. It's nearly unstoppable. The defending king has to run and catch it. And when that defending king does run and catch that outside passed pawn, the game is essentially over because the king is out of play to either save his own pawns or stop any additional passed pawns that white might have. It's just game over. And actually the same is true in minor piece endgames. Minor pieces naturally control more squares in the middle of the board, and if they have to go to the edge of the board to catch, say, a passed pawn, they also end up severely out of position to try to go capture the pawns. Rooks, on the other hand, are different. Rooks control the same number of squares no matter where they are on the chessboard. They always control 14 squares. So therefore, the general principles for rook and pawn endgames are also a little bit different, because a rook has no problem catching an outside passed pawn, and if it does so, it's not out of position. The rook controls just as many squares on the edge as it does on the center. Okay, and that's another thing about rooks. That's why rooks they don't care where they're located on the board. All 64 squares are the same to them. They just want a position where they have open files, open lines. They want to be able to, get to the enemy pawns, etc. So they don't really care about their specific position on the board, and because of that, they also don't care about the specific position of their enemy's passed pawns. So in rook and pawn endgames, central passed pawns are actually quite a bit stronger. And the reason central passed pawns are quite a bit stronger is because typically we have to escort a passed pawn up the board with our king. We can't get it up the board with our rook alone. You know, for example, if I placed this rook behind the pawn and tried to push it up the board, you could simply blockade it by planting your rook directly in front of it. The only way I'm breaking that blockade is with my king. My king has to come over and push that rook out of the way. I can't get my rook out and beside the pawn to push it down the board. And of course, we all know that rooks don't belong in front of the pawns because they start losing scope as we move those pawns up the board. That's not an ideal location for it. So we're going to need to use our king to escort it. And once we finally do get our passed pawn up the board and the defending rook sacrifices for that passed pawn, the attacking king will actually end up out of position of the other pawns. So the reverse is going to be true in rook and pawn endgames. The king that has to escort his passed pawn up the board is going to end up out of position if he has to escort an outside passed pawn. So anyways, enough of the general principles. Let's see how they're applied. So when this move f5 was played, the person playing the white pieces was rated around 1700, and the person playing black was right around 2000. And what happened is f5 got played, and the person playing the white pieces played e takes f5 instantly. Now, to conceptualize exactly how bad of a move this actually is, white's position went from major advantage white to complete equality after e takes f5. And that's white still being up a pawn. And actually black, after e takes f5, g takes f5, is probably a smidge better, because white is the one that now has to find a very exacting defense just to survive, whereas black is going to just play a couple of very natural moves and make some very serious threats. So I know this is a lot to take in, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you these variations while you're looking at the engine readout, and you can actually see what I see. You can see that this isn't just based on these general principles of central passed pawns are stronger than outside passed pawns. This is also based on just concrete analysis that we can confirm with engines. The general principles also apply within this concrete framework. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to bring up Stockfish 14.1. I'm going to load Stockfish. I'm going to move it into position over here so you can see it. And I want you to read this engine readout with me. We'll kind of get this positioned here. Expand it a little bit so we can see more lines. And I want you to see the assessment here after f5. So the assessment after f5 is major advantage white. White's doing pretty good. After e takes f5, I want you to see how far this assessment falls. E takes f5, the assessment went down to complete equality. And the assessment dropped just really significantly. And after gf5, if we actually let this run, this will actually pitter out to all zeros if you let it run for any length of time. And after a few more lackadaisical moves, it's actually very easy for white to end up lost, and that's actually what happened in the game. White played a few more kind of automatic lackadaisical moves, just assuming his position was better, and ended up completely losing. He had king b3, we have e4, just advancing the central passed pawn. This is another general principle of rook and pawn endgames. It actually doesn't matter how many pawns you have. The main thing that matters is how far up the board those pawns are and how close they are to making a queen. This puts more pressure on your opponent's position. If this a pawn had been all the way on a6 and had been about to make a queen, it would be a different story. But the pawn on e4 is super powerful, big problem. The assessment, as you can see, it keeps dropping. It's now all zeros, and this is only if white finds the only defense. But f takes e4, and if white continues to play kind of lazy chess, the number of moves that he has at his disposal that allow him to get a draw become less and less and less. So after king e5, if he continues to play lazy, really what he needs to start doing, like white needs to start going active immediately and trying to just get really active with his rook and get behind the pawns and just try to do some active defensive play to save the position. White should already be in save mode. If he's not in save mode, he's nearly losing after king d4. Rook h3 should still barely save, but if he fails to play rook h3, it's all over. And now that's it. After h3, e3, you can see that the computer assessment just went from equality to major advantage black, and now black should be completely winning in this position. And actually, it all works itself out. And it's just very classic. If white escorts his outside passed pawn up the board, and black does the same, eventually white has to sacrifice for the central passer, and notice black's king's position. That's why these general principles apply. Black's king is in position, white's king is still out of position. Now, in this case, even if the pawn had been further up the board, white would still be losing. But if we play this logical scenario out, eventually black will still have to sacrifice for this. But this h-pawn, as we can see, is 1.5 miles ahead of white. And we're just going to make a new queen, and that's going to be the end of it. So what should this person that had this really great position after f5, what should he have done? Well, he should have maintained the pawn structure and maintained the symmetry and just played king b3 and tried to shove that pawn up the board. Now, it's actually very tricky to try to win here with white. One of the issues is the pawn isn't really far enough up the board for white to make progress. We have this principle in chess with passed pawn called, 3 ranks of separation between the king and the checking distance. And black has plenty of checking distance here. So white actually shouldn't be able to make progress, and actually the rook pawn is the hardest pawn to make progress with because you can't really find shelter and it's really difficult. He needs to finagle a way to get his rook to the open file. He needs to actually get his rook temporarily in front of the pawn in some cases, and he needs to finagle a way to push that pawn up the board. Now there's tricky ways to try it, but if black plays correctly, he should be able to hold a draw. So like king b3, rook b6, king c2. Rook a6, king b3 would immediately be a draw. So white can try to finagle something here. So we can try something like rook e3, just kind of hanging out and hoping for some errors. You know, maybe f takes e4, f takes e4. We'll just have some lazy moves here. King d6, rook d3, king back to e6, and now we'll just play like a waiting move, you know, g3. Basically, the only way white's going to win this is if black makes a mistake and allows white to move his pawn forward with some sort of tempo. So for example, like rook a4, rook e3, king d6. King d6 would be an error because we're going to be hitting the rook on a4 with tempo, like king b3. Rook a8, we're going to be playing rook d3 with tempo, king back to e6, and now a4 with tempo. And if we could get something like this, the king is sufficiently cut off, and now the pawn is sufficiently far enough up the board that we would actually have a decisive position. And you can see now the engine readout is like up to +4. Before it was equality. But we were counting on a couple of mistakes from black in order to make that happen. We needed some mistakes. Without those mistakes, black should still be equal and black should still be fine. So an example of how this would proceed is something like rook b8, king a3. We'd actually hide behind the pawn. The rook would go active, and then we would make progress by threatening to put our rook behind our own passed pawn, but also just threatening to block the checks and create some sort of shelter so we can push our passed pawn up the board further while simultaneously keeping the king on e6 cut off from any hope of ever defending that pawn. So you can see this is another one of those weird situations where you have to take what you think you know about general principles and kind of throw it out the window. General principles apply, but not the beginner level of general principles. The beginner level of general principles is a piece is not in the center unless it's planted there. The advanced level of general principles is a piece can attack the center of the board from a place that's not necessarily in the middle, like a fianchetto. And as you can see, this rook is incredibly well placed. General principles love this rook, but these are advanced general principles. This rook is simultaneously cutting off the king while threatening to get behind to the pawn and threatening to shield our own king from a series of checks. And this is the absolute correct winning method. Another winning method to keep in mind here is the chuck pawns to get your pawn further up the board approach. So for example, rook b1, rook b3, rook e1. The best thing to do here is to not even attempt to defend that e-pawn and not care that it's dying and chuck your pawn up the board. Throwing away a couple of pawns to get that pawn further up the board, again, how far your pawns are up on the board is more important than how many pawns you have. As white in this position, you should be willing to give up all your pawns, like rook e4, king a5, rook e2, just to get your pawn further up that board. So now white's actually down a pawn in this position, but completely winning. And this is actually the correct winning approach. And it's a little anti-instinctual. When you're up a pawn in a rook and pawn endgame, what's the correct approach to win? Well, it's to sacrifice two of them and get your passed pawn up the board as far as possible. That's the correct winning approach. And that is a general principle of these endgames, is, chuck these pawns so that you can get your pawn up the board, because the main goal of these endgames is to make that queen and to, get that pawn up the board. But that would have been the correct approach to trying to win. And like I said, with correct play, this position should really just be a draw. Black should be able to keep white from making significant progress in this position, and he should be able to just barely hold this draw in this position. But again, after ef5, gf5, you can see that the assessment is dropped to complete equality, and actually beyond complete equality, probably black is a little bit better. The central passed pawn that is further up the board is a huge advantage for black, and now white is on the back foot, and white has to go active just to try to draw. So these are some basic principles of some rook and pawn endgames, and this is a basic rook and pawn endgame that I saw somebody misplay, and I thought it was very instructive. So anyways, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you can use some of these ideas in your own games, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much.